My name is Madeline Ross. I'm 32 years old. You don't deserve to stand in these ranks." My father, General Charles Ross, said it loud enough for the entire hall of the Pentagon to stop breathing. I stood still, no protest, no tears. The white lights above poured down on the shoulder where he had just torn away my uniform medals, scattering across the cold marble floor. Rows of uniforms lined the seats' eyes, a mix of shock and quiet judgment. In that silence, an admiral in the front row shifted slightly. His gaze swept over the black ink that had briefly surfaced at my shoulder, a symbol almost no one here remembered. He said nothing, but I saw his lips press together as if swallowing a secret. I stood there in the great hall of the Pentagon. No one knew the truth they were missing. No one knew. But they will. Because this isn't the first time I've been underestimated, but it might be the last. Come with me, to see who I became. And what happened to the one who once dismissed me? The echo of his words still lingered in the vast room, even as the rustle of uniforms settled into a tense stillness. I kept my eyes forward, my breathing measured as if each inhale was a choice, and each exhale a release I couldn't afford to squander. The weight of the space pressed in from every direction, the marble pillars, the vaulted ceiling, the harsh symmetry of the light. Every detail seemed sharpened as if my mind wanted to record it exactly as it was. The hall smelled faintly of polished brass and old paper. The floor beneath me was unforgiving, its chill seeping through the soles of my shoes. Somewhere behind me, a chair creaked, the smallest reminder that we were not statues. I did not turn to see who had moved. My father stood only a few steps away, but in that moment, the distance felt like miles. He did not look at me. His attention was fixed on the insignia and ribbons lying where they had fallen, as though their absence from my uniform was the only truth he trusted. Whispers began at the edges, ripples of sound moving inward, stopping short of where I stood. No one dared speak directly to me. It was not fear of me, not yet, but of the situation. No one wanted to be the first to take a side. The Admiral's stillness in the front row drew my attention again, though I did not let my gaze linger. His silence was deliberate, the kind of silence that carries weight in a room like this. I had seen it before in places far from here, where life and death decisions hinged on a single unspoken understanding. My right shoulder still tingled where the fabric had torn away, where air had touched skin not meant to be exposed in this place. The ink beneath it was no accident. It had been earned in silence under the kind of conditions that strip you bare and rebuild you into something unrecognizable. That symbol was more than a mark. It was a memory, a promise, a debt paid in full and still collecting interest. I felt the room's curiosity hanging in the air like static. They didn't know what it meant, not all of them, but they knew enough to suspect it mattered. I shifted my stance slightly, not to retreat, but to anchor myself more firmly to the spot. There was power in stillness. My father's voice had carried the sharpness of authority, but authority can be broken. Respect once lost cannot be reclaimed in the same shape. I had no interest in reclaiming it from him. The side door opened briefly, letting in a strip of cooler air from the corridor. A staff officer stepped inside, paused, and then took a seat at the far end, his eyes carefully avoiding mine. It was a practiced avoidance, the kind that tells you someone already knows more than they can say. Above the murmur of the room, the ticking of the clock in the back seemed louder than it should have been. Each second felt heavier than the last. I could feel the balance of the moment, how easily it could tilt into chaos or fall into a brittle waiting calm. I kept my hands at my sides, my posture steady. I had learned long ago that posture could be armor. Somewhere near the front, a cough broke the silence. The Admiral shifted again this time, leaning slightly toward the man beside him. I could not hear the words, but I saw the faint movement of lips, the nod that followed. It was not casual. Whatever they shared between them, it was about me. I thought briefly of the countless hours I had spent standing just like this in desert heat, in freezing wind, in rain that seeped into every seam of my clothing. The physical strain was never the hardest part. The hardest part was keeping your mind still while everything around you tried to shake it loose. Here in this hall, that skill served me again. The brass at my feet caught the light and flashed faintly a reminder of what had been stripped away, at least in the eyes of this room. To me, they were only symbols. The real work, the real cost had never been worn on my chest. My father moved at last, turning his back to me without a word, walking toward the far exit. The sound of his footsteps faded into the murmur of the crowd. No one followed him. I did not watch him leave. My gaze stayed forward, fixed on the door I would eventually walk through myself. Not yet. Not until I chose the moment. Because here, in this quiet between breaths, something had shifted. Not for them, not yet, but for me. A line had been drawn. And I knew, even if they didn't, that this was not the end of my presence in this hall. I let my eyes close for a single breath, just enough to feel the weight of the room without seeing it. When I opened them again, nothing had changed in the marble and brass, but the air felt different, as if somewhere a decision had already been made. And I knew, so did the Admiral. I grew up in a house where silence was considered strength. Not the warm kind of silence, the kind that lets you rest or think, but the cold kind, heavy with unspoken rules. My father, General Charles Ross, never needed to raise his voice to make a point. The weight of his expectations spoke louder than anything he could have said. We lived in a 2-story colonial outside Quantico, where the lines between home and base blurred until they were indistinguishable. The walls were lined with framed photographs of military ceremonies, commendations, and the kind of medals that catch light, even in a darkened hallway. I remember tracing the engraved names on them with my fingers, wondering what it would feel like to have one with my own name. From as far back as I can remember, my father treated me less like a daughter and more like a soldier in early training. At 8 years old, I learned to stand at attention in the backyard while he corrected my posture. He would point to my shoulders, telling me to square them like you mean it. My mother had left long before that, and there was no one to soften his edges. At school, I learned early that my father's reputation preceded me. Teachers looked at me as though I were an extension of him, not my own person. That shadow followed me into every activity, every achievement. Winning a race wasn't mine. It was proof I had his discipline. Losing wasn't mine either. It was proof I hadn't lived up to his name. By the time I was 17, I stopped trying to win his approval. It wasn't an announcement or a rebellion. It was quieter than that. A choice I made alone in the corner of my room while folding the acceptance letter from the military academy into my desk drawer. I had earned it on my own merit, but he called it expected. The academy was the first place I understood what it meant to build something without him watching. But even there, his shadow stretched across the training fields. Instructors who had served with him carried their own set of expectations for me, higher, sharper, and far less forgiving. My mistakes were amplified. My successes were met with nods, never praise. I learned to adapt, to become invisible when I needed to, and to stand out only when it was useful. I built a quiet kind of resilience, one that didn't need an audience. The first deployment came sooner than I expected, a last-minute transfer into a specialized reconnaissance unit overseas. I was 19, barely past the point where I could legally buy a drink, yet entrusted with the kind of operations that never make headlines. My orders came sealed, my missions debriefed in rooms without windows. I excelled, not because I was fearless, but because I understood the value of patience, of waiting for the moment when action mattered most. Still, even those early years carried the same pattern. My contributions were recorded in after-action reports, but never spoken of. My name was omitted from citations more often than not. I told myself it didn't matter. That recognition wasn't the point. But the truth is, invisibility is a double-edged blade. It can protect you, but it can also erase you. I suppose that's why I noticed, even in those early days, how people looked at certain patches, certain markings. Symbols that didn't appear on any official roster. The first time I saw the black and silver emblem of the Phoenix Shadow Unit, I didn't understand it. Later I would. They came for me quietly, without ceremony. One day I was on assignment in the Baltic. The next, I was in an unmarked hangar reading a contract that didn't look like a contract at all. "You'll disappear into a program that doesn't exist," the recruiter told me. "Do you understand the cost?" I nodded. And that was the last ordinary day I ever had. Phoenix Shadow wasn't just another unit. It was the answer to problems no one wanted to admit existed. We were ghosts, operating without acknowledgement, our identities scrubbed from official channels. We existed only in the spaces between the order given and the results delivered. My years there taught me more than I thought a person could hold. How to navigate a city without leaving a trace. How to dismantle a threat before it even realized you were in the room. How to carry out an objective so precise the world would never know it had been necessary. I made friends there, if you can call people you trust with your life friends. We were bound by the work, by the understanding that no one outside our circle could ever know the details. We learned each other's strengths and covered each other's weaknesses without being asked. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it ended. Officially, the unit was disbanded. In reality, we scattered. Some left the service entirely. Others were reassigned under new names and clean files. I carried my mark, the Phoenix Wings, with the single star in a place that could be hidden under a uniform but never erased. I never told my father. Not because I wanted to keep it from him, but because there was no point. Phoenix Shadow didn't exist, and to men like him, what didn't exist had no value. In the years that followed, I went back to standard assignments, but it was never the same. The work felt smaller, the stakes less real. My father still saw me as a capable officer, but never as anything beyond that. It wasn't until the operation overseas, the one that led me to the hall in the Pentagon, that I realized the shadow I had lived under all my life wasn't just his. There were others older and deeper, and some of them had learned how to use him as a weapon. By then, I knew enough to recognize the first moves of a long game. The only question was whether I'd be given the chance to play mine. It began, as these things often do, with something small enough to ignore. A message that arrived out of sequence. A file stamped with the right classification but the wrong font in the footer. A radio check that returned a fraction of a second too fast to have bounced from the repeater we were told to use. None of it mattered on its own. Together, they felt like grit between moving parts, not enough to halt the machine, just enough to tell you it was wearing down. We had rotated back from a long stretch overseas, the kind that blurs weeks into a single sleep-sanded memory. The debrief was held in a windowless room that smelled faintly of carpet glue and burnt coffee. I spoke when I had to measured and economical, and I watched as the senior officers pretended to be listening while their eyes tracked the clock on the wall. When it ended, I gathered my notes and slipped them into a folder with my name printed on the tab. Later, that same folder would be produced as evidence against me. But that day, it was just paper. The call came 2 mornings after the debrief. I was told to report to a conference room I had never used before. It was colder than the others, the kind of cold that makes you fold your hands to keep the blood moving. My father sat at one end of the table. He did not greet me. A colonel I'd only met in passing read from a prepared statement that used my name as if it belonged to a stranger. There had been a breach of protocol during the staging phase of the operation. Certain files had been accessed by a credential assigned to me. A storage facility I had never entered now carried a log that suggested I had passed through at 0203 and again at 0209 too quickly to be plausible and yet apparently true because the system said it was. I listened. I did not argue. Arguments perform badly against the shape of a decision that has already hardened. The colonel glanced at my father between paragraphs as if waiting for a signal to soften the blow. He didn't get one. When the reading ended, they asked if I had anything to say for the record. I said only that my badge had been in sealed custody during the time they were citing, and that if the seals were examined closely, they might find heat distortion beneath the adhesive. The colonel wrote something down, perhaps the word deflection, perhaps nothing at all. They reassigned me the next day. Not a demotion. It is possible to move someone downward without moving them on paper. The language was neutral temporary duties pending review. My inbox filled with messages that said nothing in many words. People I had worked beside for years slipped away from the table when I approached, not unkindly, but with the careful avoidance of those who do not want to catch whatever you have been accused of. I don't blame them. Institutions are living things. They protect themselves. Someone slid an anonymous note under my door. 3 words. Check the clocks. It was not signed. I set it on my desk and looked at it for a long time. Then I put it in a book and closed the cover. The rumors were polite at first. A misunderstanding, an administrative error, a review that would resolve itself. Then the tone shifted. People love the gravity of a verdict even before it's reached. I learned the contour of their new silence, how it pooled when I entered a room and drained when I left. In the gym, barbells clanged louder than usual. In the hallways, shoes squeaked on waxed floors like punctuation marks after sentences no one would own aloud. I have been ignored before. It is not a new country to me. But there is a difference between ordinary invisibility and the kind that is assigned to you, like a uniform you never asked to wear. The first is a choice, the second is a sentence. On the third night, I sat alone at my kitchen table and opened a box I hadn't touched in years. Inside were thin notebooks, the cheap kind you can buy anywhere, each marked with a number and a date in my small, even handwriting. They were not official records. They did not contain secrets, only impressions. Times, temperatures, the sensation of a door that closed too easily for a door that heavy. The things you notice when you cannot afford to miss the small hinge on which a big outcome might turn. I turned the pages slowly, and in the margin of an old entry, I found a note to myself. Trust the pattern, not the noise. The pattern when I let it come into focus was simple. Something had shifted in the days before we returned home. An access request that should have required 2 signatures passed with 1. A shipment that should have arrived on a marked truck came on an unmarked one with the right paperwork. A camera that had been unreliable for months recorded flawless footage on the single night it most needed to fail. These are the kinds of things only matter if you have lived in the space where they can get you killed. I had lived there. I knew what I was looking at. I did not tell anyone, not yet. Instead, I did what I have always done. I showed up on time. I kept my tone level. I made no sudden moves. I kept my uniform pressed and my boots clean because there is a discipline to caring for what is within reach when the rest has been taken out of your hands. My father called me to his office once during that week. He stood by the window with his back to me watching the parking lot as if it contained a horizon worth studying. He asked if there was anything I wanted to clarify. I said no. He asked if I had anything to confess. I said no. He did not turn around. We stood like that for a long minute, the distance between us measured in the kind of silence we had both been trained to endure. When I left, he thanked me for coming the way a superior thanks an inferior for complying with an inconvenient order. On Friday, a meeting was convened. The invitation came from a name that carried weight, and the location was one I recognized from earlier years, bright with polished wood and the smell of fresh paint. I took a seat near the back and listened as an investigation team presented a timeline that included me in careful, neutral phrases. The photographs were reassuringly dull. The graphs were clean. The facts lined up as facts do when they are asked to tell a particular kind of story. Near the end, a slide appeared on the screen that made the room lean forward as one. My face grainy but distinct, captured by a corridor camera as I turned my head toward the lens. The timestamp in the corner matched the hour of the alleged breach. No one spoke. The presenter let the image settle before moving on as if the slide were not a hammer, but the pause that makes the blow fall heavier. I kept my breathing steady. I had seen the camera angle before in another building with another name. I knew the resolution that model could produce and the compression artifacts it should leave at that light level. The artifacts in the photo were wrong by a fraction, not enough to convince a room, but enough to convince me. I wrote nothing down. People look for notes when they want to know what you think. Afterwards, in the corridor, an officer I barely knew stopped beside me and asked without preamble how I had learned to carry weight like this. I almost laughed. Practice, I said. He nodded once and walked away. That night, I ran until my legs felt blunt, then walked home under a sky that had the washed-out look of late winter. At my door, I found a second note. 2 lines this time. The server drifted 9 seconds. Reconcile to GPS. It is a strange thing to feel relief while you are being dismantled. Not joy, never that, but the steadiness that comes when a loose thread in your mind finally finds the seam it belongs to. 9 seconds is a lifetime in the places that taught me how to count. 9 seconds can make a clean lie out of a messy truth. I held the paper between my fingers and thought about the faces in the room, about the way certainty had settled into their shoulders. I thought about my father, about the Admiral who had swallowed a secret instead of saying it aloud. I thought about all the rooms I had stood in where the most important thing was not what you said, but how long you could stand saying nothing. If I had spoken, then I would have explained it simply. But this was not the moment for explanations. It was the moment for inventory, what I had lost, and what I was willing to carry into the next room if they insisted on opening it. They would. They always do. Doubt is a quiet thing when it arrives. It doesn't slam the door or throw its weight across the room. It just walks in, sits down, and waits for you to notice. I noticed it 3 days after the meeting with the grainy photograph. The morning light coming through my kitchen window looked the same as it always did, pale and different, but I found myself staring into my coffee as if it might give me an answer I hadn't already turned over in my head. Maybe they're right. The thought didn't roar. It whispered. It asked the kinds of questions I would never let anyone else voice. Had I missed something? Had I moved through those days too quickly, left a seam open somewhere for someone else to stitch a falsehood into? The certainty I had carried through worse places began to feel like something I had been renting, not owning. I still showed up to work, still wore the uniform. But each morning as I stood in front of the mirror, my own reflection felt further away, like I was looking at a version of myself that existed only for other people's comfort. The calls from friends stopped. Not suddenly, but in the way a river dries smaller and smaller streams until the bed is bare. The people who still nodded at me in hallways did so with the polite detachment reserved for those whose proximity is temporary. The unspoken assumption eventually she'll be gone. One night I went running just to feel something I could control. The cold air burned in my lungs. My breath formed quick clouds that dissolved as soon as they appeared. I stopped at the edge of the river and listened to the ice crack in slow, deliberate sounds. It reminded me of radio static in a foreign city waiting for a voice to cut through. When I got home, there was a message waiting. Not in my inbox, not in my mailbox, but slipped under the door in the same narrow envelope as before. The handwriting was the same angular, unhurried. It read, "There's a name you haven't looked at yet. No signature, no explanation. Just enough to set the doubt in a new direction." I put it aside and didn't open my notebooks that night. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table, fingers wrapped around a mug that had long gone cold. I thought about the missions where I'd been the one to deliver messages like that just enough to push someone forward without giving them the whole map. I thought about the trust it took to follow something that small, but I didn't follow it immediately. I told myself I needed more time, but the truth was I didn't trust my own judgment enough to move yet. The days that followed were a study in withdrawal. I spoke less. I kept my head down in briefings, taking notes I knew no one would read. I began leaving my phone in a desk drawer, the silence of it a small mercy. It was during this quiet that a name from my past surfaced, not from the envelope that remained closed in my desk, but from an unexpected place. A junior officer in logistics mentioned a supply request that had been rerouted through a warehouse I knew from my Phoenix Shadow years. The paperwork was clean, the dates unremarkable, but the sign-off code was one I'd seen before and not in the right context. The moment I saw it, something in me shifted, not enough to call it resolve, but enough to make me sit up a little straighter. That night, I pulled the envelope from my desk and opened it fully. Inside was a single page torn from a notebook, the kind the supply office used to keep near the requisition desk. In the margin next to a series of numbers was a name, Calder. I knew the name. I remembered the face not well, but enough to place him near the outer edges of operations I'd been part of. Someone who moved boxes and signed manifests, but never seemed to be tied to one unit for long. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I spread my old notebooks across the kitchen table, cross-referencing dates and supply chains, tracing the faint lines between assignments that were never meant to connect. By dawn, I had more questions than answers, but for the first time in days, I also had direction. The next afternoon, a message came through the secure internal network. It was brief. Meet me at 1900. Bring nothing you can't lose. The sender's code was one I hadn't seen in years, belonging to someone who had once pulled me out of a city before it fell apart. At 1900, I walked into a dimly lit storage room on the far side of the compound. He was there older, more worn but unmistakable. No handshake, no greeting, just the exchange of a small sealed envelope and a nod toward the door. Inside the envelope was a single page from an after-action report, heavily redacted, but one line remained intact: operational integrity compromised via internal asset. Next to it in handwriting I recognized as his were two words: prove it. That was the first real movement I'd had in weeks, a task, however undefined, something to step toward instead of away from. As I walked back to my quarters, the doubt was still there. It hadn't vanished, but it no longer sat at the center of the room. It had been pushed to the edge where I could watch it without letting it speak too loudly. I knew then that I wouldn't fade quietly from this place. Not yet. I had one thing left to do before they decided what to do with me. The first thing I did was stop moving in straight lines. Routine is a comfort for people who are safe. For everyone else, it's an invitation. I varied my hours, shifted my routes, left rooms through doors I hadn't entered. I spoke less in open spaces and more in places with bad lighting and poor acoustics. People notice change, but they rarely notice why. The name Calder stayed with me. Not in the front of my mind, but coiled somewhere deeper like a cord waiting to be pulled. I didn't approach him. Not yet. I needed the edges first, the indirect routes that tell you more than the straight ones. 2 days after the meeting in the storage room, I received another message through the internal network. Same sender as before. This time, just coordinates and a time 0400. Don't be followed. I didn't have to be told twice. The coordinates led me to an equipment depot I hadn't visited in years. The building was quiet lights dimmed to their night setting, the hum of refrigeration units filling the air. He was already there, leaning against a stack of unmarked crates, a small terminal balanced on top. "This isn't a favor," he said without preamble. "You've been marked. Whoever's running this wants you erased, not reassigned." I didn't flinch. "Then we need to get ahead of them." He slid the terminal toward me. On the screen was a list of access logs for the weeks surrounding the operation I'd been accused of compromising. Calder's name appeared twice, each time paired with a location impossible to reach without bypassing 3 levels of clearance. The times were tight, so tight they didn't make sense unless the logs had been adjusted after the fact. "They're sloppy," I said. "They're confident," he corrected, and confidence leaves gaps. We agreed on one thing immediately: no confrontation, no accusations, not yet. If Calder was part of something larger rattling him too soon, would send the whole thing underground. We needed to map the structure before we put weight on any of it. I started small. I requested transfer logs for equipment that had passed through my old assignments. Not directly, but through a series of routine audits filed under other officers' credentials with their consent. Quiet favors unrecorded. The results trickled in over days, and a pattern began to form: equipment routed through the same set of depots, the same clearance officers signing off the same gaps in surveillance footage. The gaps told me more than the footage could. Cameras went dark in predictable rhythms, a handful of minutes here, a misplaced file there. Not enough to flag, but enough for someone to move without leaving a clean trail. Every night I copied the relevant entries into a separate encrypted ledger. Not the kind issued by the department, one of my own. Years ago in Phoenix Shadow, we'd kept 2 ledgers, the one they could find and the one they couldn't. The first tangible proof came on a Thursday. A requisition order for munitions was routed through a warehouse that didn't appear on any current inventory list. The signature on the approval line wasn't Calder's, it was my father's, and I knew as sure as I knew my own name that he hadn't read it. He'd signed it during one of his marathon briefing days, rubber stamping half a dozen approvals at a time. Someone had slipped it in under cover of routine. That told me 2 things: Calder had access to my father's approval queue, and whoever he was working with understood his habits well enough to weaponize them. The next step was harder. I had to make contact with someone who could corroborate what I was seeing without risking the trail. That meant pulling in a favor I'd been holding for years. Her name was Rachel Moore, a systems auditor who had once owed me her life in a border city no one admits we ever set foot in. She didn't ask questions when I called. She just told me where to meet her. We sat in the back booth of a diner that still smelled faintly of bleach from the night shift's cleaning. I slid her a copy of one log entry stripped of names, but not of times or anomalies. "You didn't get this from me," I said. She studied it for a long moment, her fingertip tracing the sequence of entries. "This isn't an error," she said finally. "It's a rewrite, and not a good one. Can you prove that without tying it to me?" She nodded once. "Give me a week." A week was more than I wanted, but less than I feared. In the meantime, I worked on something else, the part of the plan that would require stepping into the open. If Calder was careful, he wouldn't touch anything he didn't have to, which meant I needed to give him something he couldn't resist. A piece of data valuable enough to draw him out but useless to anyone else. The bait took the form of an after-action addendum for the operation in question. I built it from fragments of real reports embedding a false checksum only detectable if you tried to verify its authenticity. Anyone who found it would assume it was legitimate until they ran that check, and the only reason to run it would be if you intended to use it. I placed the file where I knew Calder could find it buried 3 layers deep in an archive flagged for internal audit. Then I waited. It took less than 48 hours. The access ping came through while I was sitting at my desk pretending to review maintenance schedules. Same signature pattern, same clearance anomalies. Calder had taken the bait. I didn't move immediately. One trap is only useful if you know where it leads. I let him keep it, let him believe he'd found something worth hiding. Because now I knew not just that he was involved, but how he moved. The next time he reached for something, I'd be there first. And when the moment came, it wouldn't be in a conference room or a briefing. It would be in a space where there were no cameras, no microphones, just 2 people and the truth between them. Until then, I kept my uniform pressed, my boots clean, and my voice steady. In a place where perception is often more dangerous than reality, those small things were the closest thing to armor I had. The day it happened, the air in the Pentagon felt heavier, as if the building itself had been waiting for me to return to that hall. The summons came through a formal channel this time, not a coded message, not an unmarked envelope, but an official directive with my name in bold. Presence required at Oversight Committee briefing, ERO 900 hours. The kind of meeting where people arrive early to make sure their chairs are in the right place. I arrived on time. Not early, not late. The hall was the same one where my father had stripped my uniform weeks earlier. The rows of seats were filled again, the polished marble reflecting the weight of ceremony. My father was there seated near the front, his posture sharp enough to cut. Calder stood behind him, a silent shadow, his expression unreadable. The hum of side conversations stopped when I stepped inside. I could feel the eyes on me, the silent cataloging of details, the set of my shoulders, the way my boots landed on the floor, the fact that I was wearing my full uniform again. Not reinstated, not officially. Just worn. At the head of the room sat Admiral Whitaker, the man whose gaze had lingered on my shoulder that first day. Now he met my eyes directly, a flicker of something there I couldn't name. Respect, perhaps, or recognition. I took my seat without speaking. The proceedings began, as they always do, a monotone reading of the agenda, the perfunctory acknowledgement of attendees. The first speaker presented an operational summary of the breach investigation. The words washed over me until I heard Calder's name spoken aloud, followed by mine. "Lieutenant Colonel Ross," the speaker said, turning to me with the bland politeness of someone asking a question they already think they know the answer to. "Do you have any response to the evidence presented?" I could have spoken, could have argued, but I didn't. Instead, I sat still. Stillness is not absence, it's control. The silence stretched just long enough to be uncomfortable. I saw people shift in their seats, glancing between me and the Admiral. My father's jaw tightened. Calder's eyes narrowed just slightly. Whitaker cleared his throat and leaned forward, his voice cutting through the tension without raising in volume. "Before we proceed, I'd like to acknowledge for the record that certain individuals in this room have served in capacities not reflected in standard personnel files. Those capacities carry implications." His gaze slid to me, then back to the room. It was the closest thing to a public acknowledgement I had ever heard from someone of his rank. No detail, no name of the unit, but enough to freeze the air. A few people in the room understood exactly what he meant. Others only felt the shift without knowing why. Calder's fingers twitched against the folder he held. It was a small movement, but I saw it. The same way I saw the faint sheen of sweat beginning at his hairline. No one moved. No one spoke. Whitaker looked at me again, holding my gaze for a beat longer than necessary. "Lieutenant Colonel," he said, "if you have anything to add, now would be the time." I shook my head, once slow and deliberate. "Nothing at this time, Admiral." It was the not speaking that landed harder than anything I could have said. The meeting continued, but the current had shifted. People were listening differently now, not to what was being said, but to what was not. I kept my eyes forward, letting the weight of the Admiral's acknowledgement hang between Calder and me like a drawn line on a map. When the briefing ended, chairs scraped against marble, and the low hum of conversation returned. But no one approached me. My father stood, his gaze flicking to mine and away again, as if the moment between us was something neither of us was ready to claim. Calder lingered near the back, speaking to no one. I didn't move toward him. Not yet. Instead, I walked slowly toward the exit, the echo of my steps carrying farther than it should have. In the doorway, I stopped. Without turning, I spoke just loudly enough for the sound to reach the far end of the room. Some truths don't need to be spoken to be understood. I didn't wait for a response. Outside, the corridor was quieter. I could feel the difference in the way people passed me. Not quite deference, not quite distance, but a recognition that something had changed. A shift in the air that would follow us all out of that room. In Phoenix Shadow, we were taught that the most decisive blows are rarely delivered in the moment they're prepared for. They land later in the silence afterward when the target realizes they've already been hit. I didn't need Calder to admit anything in that hall. I only needed him to know I had seen the edges of his shadow, and that I was willing to stand exactly where he had hoped I wouldn't, in full view, in full uniform, without saying a word. For now, that was enough. It happened 2 days later, in a room with no windows, and a table large enough to seat a dozen, though only 5 of us were present. The Admiral was there, seated at the head. My father was to his left, his uniform impeccable, his expression controlled but pale. Calder sat 2 chairs down from him, a file folder closed in front of him like a shield. Across from them sat Commander Harris from Internal Oversight, his tablet already recording. I was the last to enter. The chair they had left for me was directly across from Calder. The choice was deliberate. The Admiral opened without ceremony. "We've completed the secondary audit. Certain anomalies were identified and cross-referenced with restricted system logs. Lieutenant Colonel Ross, the floor is yours." I reached into my bag and set a small encrypted drive on the table. This contains the full chain of requisition approvals for the last 18 months involving munitions routed through non-standard depots. Every irregular clearance, every time-stamped log, and every badge credential used. It also includes the GPS-synced server records that reveal the 9-second drift in the depot logs, the same drift exploited to insert my name into the breach timeline. Harris's stylus paused above his tablet. "You're asserting that the breach was fabricated. I'm asserting that it was engineered," I said evenly, "and that it was engineered by someone in this room." The Admiral's eyes didn't leave Calder, but he didn't speak. My father's head turned sharply toward me. "Careful," he said, the warning edge in his voice almost reflexive. I met his gaze. "I've been careful my entire life." I tapped the drive. The data shows multiple badge entries for Calder within minutes of my father's, including times when my father was in briefings across the building. It shows requisition approvals carrying his digital signature inserted into my father's queue at the exact moment he was batch signing other routine documents. It shows a pattern of missing surveillance footage replaced with doctored video using an encoder not installed on any of our systems. And it shows bank transfers routed through shell corporations tied to the same syndicate Phoenix Shadow dismantled 10 years ago. The silence in the room felt heavier than the walls. Calder didn't move at first. Then he let out a slow, controlled breath. "That's a creative narrative," he said. "I assume you've got an equally creative explanation for why your name appears in half those same logs." I leaned forward, my voice steady. "Because you put it there, and because you thought no one would notice the residue. But systems remember more than people do. They remember the wrong clock, the wrong codec, the wrong habits." The Admiral spoke then, his tone sharp. We ran an independent verification. The data matches her claims. The drift the encoder mismatched the forged badge logs, all confirmed. And the financial trail. He let the sentence hang. My father's gaze flicked to Calder confusion and something darker in his eyes. I didn't look away from him. They used you, I said quietly. They used your signature, your authority, your belief that loyalty means never questioning the people closest to you. And they used that to come after me. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the air vents. Then the Admiral turned fully to Calder. You're done. 2 military police officers entered silently, their boots dull against the carpet. Calder didn't protest. He didn't even look at me as they cuffed him, only at my father. There was no apology in his expression, only the satisfaction of someone who had played his hand to the last card. As they let him out, he spoke over his shoulder. This doesn't end with me. The door closed behind them. My father sat back, his hands flat on the table. He looked older than I'd ever seen him. I didn't know he said as if saying it aloud might make it true. I kept my voice even. You didn't ask. He flinched at that just slightly. They told me you were compromised. They showed me files logs. I thought I was protecting the service. You thought you were protecting your name, I said. But names mean nothing if you can't live with the truth. The Admiral didn't interrupt. Neither did Harris. The room had become a space for a reckoning that belonged only to us. My father's eyes dropped to the table. What happens now? That's up to you, I said. You can stand in front of the same people who watched you strip my uniform and tell them what really happened. Or you can let the record stand as it is and live with that choice. He didn't answer. The Admiral rose, signaling the meeting's end. Lieutenant Colonel Ross, your record will be cleared effective immediately. All prior commendations reinstated. You're free to return to active duty. I stood. With respect, Admiral, I won't be returning. I've spent enough years in shadows. It's time to do something different. He gave a single nod. Then, I wish you luck. And for what it's worth, you've served this country in ways most will never understand. As I walked out of the room, the drive still on the table behind me, I didn't look back. Some things are better left in the hands of those who now know the weight they carry. Outside the corridor felt warmer, the air less tight in my chest. My name was mine again, though it no longer mattered as much as it once had. What mattered was that the truth had been set loose, and truths once freed have a way of finding their mark. 6 months later, the rhythm of my days bore no resemblance to the ones I'd lived in uniform. I rented a modest workspace in an old brick building on the edge of Arlington high ceilings. Wide windows, floors worn smooth by decades of footsteps. The sign outside read simply, Ross Foundation. Inside, there was nothing ceremonial about it. 2 desks, a wall of filing cabinets, coffee always brewing. On the far wall, a series of photographs, men and women who had served and been left adrift, their names often missing from the records they'd earned the right to occupy. I came in early most mornings before the street outside fully woke. The quiet wasn't the cold kind I'd grown up with. It was the kind that lets you choose how to fill it. I'd brew the first pot of coffee, open the windows if the air was good, and sort through grant applications. Stories came in from every state, each one a small ledger of service and sacrifice, and the long, slow work of rebuilding. People asked me sometimes why I didn't go back, why I walked away just as my record had been cleared, my name restored. I never had an easy answer for them, but the truth was simple. You can step out of the shadows, but only if you stop walking toward them. I had spent enough years on missions no one would ever speak of. I wanted the work in front of me to have a name, a face, and a place in daylight. The Admiral visited once unannounced. He stepped into the office in full uniform, still carrying the presence that made a room straighten around him. "You're hard to find these days," he said. "I'm not hiding," I told him. "Just building something different." He walked the length of the office, his eyes passing over the photographs, the stacks of applications, the worn carpet. "It's good work," he said finally. Then he looked at me in that way he had during the hearings, weighing the unspoken. "Phoenix Shadow is being reactivated. I want you to command it." There was a time when those words would have pulled me back without hesitation. Now they felt like a door to a room I'd already emptied. "I appreciate it," I said, "but I'm done living in places where the truth can't breathe." He studied me for a moment, then nodded once. I thought you might say that. The offer stands, and for what it's worth, I'm proud of you. When he left, the room felt quieter but not empty. My father came only once. He didn't wear his uniform that day. Civilian clothes made him look smaller somehow, though the lines in his face were still cut deep. He stood just inside the doorway, his hands in his pockets, and for a moment neither of us spoke. I came to apologize, he said finally, for believing them, for letting my pride speak louder than my trust in you. I didn't answer right away. The truth was, I didn't need his apology to move forward, but I understood that he might need to give it. I don't need you to fight for the family name anymore, I said. I just need you to understand the cost when you choose not to see the truth. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. I understand. When he left, I didn't feel lighter or heavier. Just steady. By autumn, the foundation had grown. We'd secured funding for housing programs, mental health resources, and legal aid for veterans whose service had been buried under layers of classification and red tape. I spent more time on the road meeting people where they were instead of asking them to come to me. In small town halls and community centers, I listened more than I spoke. The work didn't need my stories, it needed theirs. Sometimes late at night, I'd think about Calder's last words as they took him from that windowless room. This doesn't end with me. I knew he was right. Networks like his don't vanish with one arrest, but I also knew I no longer had to hunt them in the same way. There are other ways to dismantle shadows. The mark on my shoulder, the black wings and single star of Phoenix shadow was still there. I didn't hide it, but I didn't display it either. It was part of me, but it didn't define me, not anymore. On quiet mornings with the first light cutting through the window and the street still empty, I'd unlock the office, start the coffee, and think about the long chain of decisions that had brought me here. When they hadn't given me a seat in the room, I'd built my own. And now, every day, the work done at that desk carried the kind of truth that didn't need to be hidden behind clearance codes or redacted lines. Some people measure their lives in rank and medals, in the number of doors they can open. I measure mine now in the faces on the wall, each one a reminder that you can lose everything you thought made you who you are and still build something worth standing in. I don't need applause for that. I don't need my name etched into a plaque. The people who matter will know, and for everyone else, they'll see the results even if they never know my name.